that I am Linda Abraham. I'm the President of Accepted and the moderator for today's webinar. Welcome to the 5 MCAT mistakes you don't want to make, to be presented by Alec Lee of MPrep. Probably the most stressful part of the medical school application process is the MCAT, especially with the recent changes and the increased length of MCAT 2015. And that's why we've invited Alec Lee, an expert in MCAT test prep, to speak here today. He spent well over 2,000 hours working with pre-meds on the MCAT since 2008, and he's going to tell you how to avoid the all too common errors and, more importantly, how to do it right. Now, before we start, a couple of housekeeping items. Alec or I may ask a few questions during the presentation and ask you to raise your hands in response. You can do so by clicking on the hand icon, 2 icons underneath the horizontal orange arrow on your control panel. Please raise your hand when you find it. Okay, so please raise your hand when you find that. Okay, great. Most of you are raising your hand. That's perfect. All right, and then as usual, we are looking forward to answering your questions, as many as possible, and we've set aside time for Q&A. So feel free to post your questions in the question window. I'll review the questions submitted and choose those that have the broadest application. If we don't get to your specific question, we'll be providing a place, so an option for you to ask questions after the webinar is over. Now, before we get to actually introducing Alec, I do have a couple of polls because we would like to get to know a little bit more about you. Let me get those polls out. Here they are. Okay. The first question is, when are you planning on taking the MCAT? Okay, so that should now be on your screen. When are you planning to take the MCAT? In spring 2016, summer 2016, or later? Okay, please, if you could let us know what you think about that. All right, we're getting a great response. Wow, 94% of you have already voted. Anybody else want to vote? I'm going to close the poll in just 1 second. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and here are the results. Okay, so most of you are planning to take it in the summer. It's 31% in the spring, 40% in the summer, and 29% later. So about almost a third of you are planning ahead. That's also great and good to know. And then the second question I have for you, the second poll I have, is how are you planning on studying for the MCAT? Self-study, meaning textbooks, AAMC practice materials, etc. Free online materials such as the Khan Academy videos, online paid courses, traditional in-class paid courses, or tutors. Please indicate which you're leaning towards at this point or have already used. Okay, and again, we have a marvelous audience. We already have 77%, 79%, 81% having voted, 85%. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm closing the poll and sharing the results. With 87% having voted, you can see that most of you are apparently going the self-study route. Apparently there's more than one vote allowed here. You're also using free online materials such as the Khan Academy videos. 37% are going for online paid courses. 22% are going for traditional in-class paid courses. And 20% are going for tutors. It'd be really interesting to know what some of those combinations are. But that'll have to be for another time. Right now, I just want to tell you a bit about our presenter and his company, MPrep. Alec Lee is co-founder of the MCAT prep company MPrep and the head instructor for its e-course. He's also been a guest on my podcast, Admission Straight Talk, and has authored an outstanding guest post for Accepted's blog. Through all my interactions with Alec, I've been very impressed with his thoughtful approach. He takes to any topic that I've asked him about. And his MCAT insights, I'm sure, will be very valuable to you as you prepare to take this critical exam. Accepted is delighted to be hosting this webinar for MPrep. Alec, the floor, and should I say the mic and screen are all yours.
And thanks for coming out. Appreciate your time and attention. So let me very quickly. So the goal of this session and what we're going to talk about is obviously the 5 mistakes, MCAT mistakes to avoid. I'm sure that some of these things aren't going to be completely novel for a lot of you, but I'm hoping that some of the perspective that I'll give you on sort of the context and what to do about some of those will hopefully be helpful for each one of these points. So Linda gave a great intro to me. As she said, I'm the co-founder of MPrep, and the only other thing that I would add to that is that I'm the author of our core MPrep strategy content, and so you'll hear me sort of make this distinction for a couple of these points between what's important for MCAT strategy and what's important for MCAT content. And those are essentially two sides of the same coin, right? They both are really important for the MCAT, but ignoring one or the other often has pretty negative consequences. And so my focus is largely on the strategy, although, of course, having taught the course for 5 years now, I know the content inside and out as well. So agenda, pretty straightforward. I'll do a brief MCAT overview. I'm sure most of you already have a decent sense of what to expect, but for anybody who doesn't, that'll be there. We'll then obviously talk about those 5 mistakes to avoid. There's going to be a practice question that I'll give you in the middle of there, so it'll be a nice interactive activity. And then I'll just sort of wrap up with some extra resources, things to remember, and we'll do the Q&A afterwards. So in terms of the MCAT overview, again, I'm sure that most of you already have a decent sense of what this looks like. In terms of the sciences sections, so that's the chem and physics, as I shorten them, the biochem, and the psych and sociology sections, they all 3 of them have 59 questions in 95 minutes, same number of discrete questions, same number of passages. And overall, if you have any context for what the old MCAT was like, there is more time per question, and that's not all of, but it is a decent amount of the increase in the amount of time for each of these sections. The CARS section, which has essentially taken the place of the verbal reasoning section from the old exam, is 9 passages. There are no discrete questions. There are 5 to 7 questions per passage, so they are a little bit longer in terms of what they're going to ask you. And these passages are relatively long, so they're on the order of up to 600 words, generally 500 to 600 words per passage. But again, those of you who know the old verbal reasoning section know that one of the biggest complaints on that section was timing. People were running out of time. A significant percentage of people ran out of time. And so one of the things that the AAMC did to address that issue was actually give you 10 minutes per passage now, which I believe is somewhere around 40% more time. And so they really want everyone to sort of be on a little bit more of a level playing field in terms of giving you the time that you need so that you don't feel incredibly rushed. Obviously, some people will still find that they're a little bit, that they do feel a little bit rushed, but those things aren't always completely avoidable. The big thing to note is this is a really long exam. This is essentially an all-day endeavor, and so stamina is really, really key. And the thing that I always tell all of my students is it is an arduous exam. It's a long road to get ready for the exam, but really take it on as an opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to have fun with science and reading, and you're going to have to do that in med school anyway. I know a lot of pre-meds come to the table thinking that this is essentially the end of the really hard work, but honestly, this is really just the beginning. Once you get to boards, it's going to be a completely different ballgame. So, this is a great way to practice and sort of get ready for the level of intention that you're going to have and attention that you're going to have for med school. So, with that, let's switch gears and go through some of the 5 mistakes. So, the first mistake. This shouldn't be news to anybody, and that is to starting too late or to rush through your MCAT prep. This is probably one of the most common mistakes. When I get students calling in, prospective students asking to work with us, the biggest concern they have is, do I have enough time? And if you're calling 6 months in advance or in a year in advance, then the answer is almost always yes, and it's great you're calling now because you don't want to be calling 2 months in advance thinking that it's going to be fine. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Runway is really, really key, and the earlier you start, the earlier you'll know what kind of timeline you're going to need in order to be ready. So this is a thing that is really, really easy to avoid, right? Some of the mistakes are harder. Some of the mistakes require more practice and require more thinking. But the earlier you start, and it's frankly really, really easy, the better off you'll be. But it's harder to fix this problem. If it's already approaching your test date and you're still not sure if you're going to be ready, you essentially just have two options, right? You can push back your test date or you can delay your application. Those two often go hand in hand. I suppose you could also just suck it up and take the exam when you've planned to take it and just hope for the best. But generally speaking, when a student doesn't think they're going to be ready, it means they're going to have to push that back their test date, and that is going to have often implications on the consideration of you as a med school applicant. So, if you're taking the exam at the end of the summer and you're not planning on applying until the next year, don't worry about it. Feel free to push back your test date. But as you start to get closer to like a May test date, that's when the pressure is really on to make sure that you're performing well, so that if you feel like you might need to retake the exam, you can prepare for that up front. The only other thing that I'll add here, so that I'm not rambling about this topic, is I'm sure that most of you already know this, but it's you want to avoid taking the exam too late in the summer of the same year that you're trying to apply. So let's say you're applying this year. If you're taking the exam, sometime, basically any time after June, you're really pushing it in terms of the timeline. Because the reality is that med schools are not going to fully review your application until they have your MCAT scores in. And that's not going to be for several weeks after you take the exam. So where most people, and I really do mean the majority of people, are submitting their applications basically within the first couple of days that it opens with their MCAT scores ready, those people are really getting evaluated first. And since a lot of interviews and secondary applications are given on a rolling basis, the later you wait, the more of a disadvantage you're going to have. And so I really advise students against waiting during the summer. And so if you're thinking, I'm definitely not going to be ready by July, mid-July, and you're going to be much better off waiting to apply the next year. Some people decide, I just want to see how it goes, get a sense of the application process. But remember, the application process is pretty expensive. And so you just want to budget out or balance out those factors there in terms of the budget, in terms of the risk that you're willing to take on as far as the application cycle is concerned, and the risk you're willing to take on in terms of your MCAT score, maybe if you take it a little bit too early than you feel you otherwise would be ready. Now, all of that is probably not news to a lot of you. What I wanted to give you guys was something a little bit more concrete about roughly what kind of expectations you should have in terms of the amount of time it might take you to actually really be ready. So this is by all means a gross generalization. Don't take this as gospel or written in stone, but generally speaking, you should expect a baseline of 8 weeks. So, whatever background you have, anything, just assume 8 weeks. And if you have pretty low comfort with the content itself, so, you haven't taken the courses in a while, you didn't perform as well as you wanted on some of the courses, you may not have taken a prerequisite or two, then you're going to be on the lower end of comfort level with the content. So at about, on the very, very low end, 6 weeks. If you feel really confident with the content, you took all the courses recently, you feel good about it, you can take 2 weeks off of that. So now we're looking at a range of 6 to 14 weeks. And then you can factor in your past standardized test performance. And you can sort of see I'm trying to build this theme of content knowledge and strategies, right? Playing the game. And standardized tests, for all intents and purposes, are their own unique game. If you're good at standardized tests and you've historically performed really well, you can shave another 2 weeks off of that. So you can bring it down to 4 weeks. And if you've historically not performed as well as you would have liked, then you can add another 4 weeks. So the range builds here. And then the amount of investment that you can make on a weekly basis. So if you're putting in 30 plus hours a week, and it's one of your primary focuses between when you start and test day, you can shave 25% of that time off. And then if you don't have a lot of time, a ton of people are working full-time, some people have families at home, it's not realistic to put in 30 hours a week. And so if your range is somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 hours a week, then you're going to want to give yourself some extra time in terms of the number of weeks. So we're looking at now a pretty broad range here, and it's really up to you to sort of feel out where you stand on this, but I think that this covers the majority of students pretty well in terms of giving them a rough sense of what to expect timing-wise. So that's mistake number one. Mistake number two is making it all about the content. And obviously I have a particular bias about this because my focus in terms of building our course was on the strategies. But I really want you to take this to heart. I've had a number of students who come to the table having performed pretty poorly on the exam despite having PhDs. And it's really not about the content. And to sort of illustrate that, on the flip side, I've had a number of students, especially early on in my MCAT test prep career when I was still trying to get a feel of what it takes to see students get high-performing scores. I would have students who I'd have serious concern about their level of content knowledge. They would email me with questions about chemistry that I thought were quite basic, and was thinking to myself, if you don't know this now, 2-3 weeks before your test date, I'm not incredibly confident about how it's going to go on test day. And those students oftentimes end up in the 90th, 95th percentile. It's pretty surprising. And so what happens on test day is absolutely a function of the content knowledge that you have, but you get rapidly diminishing marginal returns on your investment in terms of focusing just on the content. And that's where practice and focus on, again, thinking about the MCAT like a game, practicing how to play the game, and potentially, if you're looking at a course, if you're looking at a tutor, working with somebody who's played the game before can really help you get a sense of, what best approaches are available for you. So I want to expand on this a little bit more because I know that something like this, when I say, oh, you should focus on strategies, I know that can be pretty vague and generic. So I'm going to try to hone in on this a little bit, and we're going to do a practice question after this. But if you've already started your studying, you might have noticed that it's kind of hard to tell what's actually testable for the exam. There is a AAMC syllabus that you can download off of their website. It's free. It basically just gives you a bulleted list of all the topics that are fair game on the exam. And this document is very, very long because there's a lot of content that you need to be prepared for. But even that still provides a lot of gray area for the depth of each of the topics that you need to know. They don't list any equations on that syllabus. They don't list specific numbers that you need to, variables that you need to know. Faraday's constant, things like that. You don't need to know Faraday's constant, but there are other facts or factoids that you should know that aren't necessarily clear. And so prep books as a unit, I know are a very, very popular method of studying, and even a lot of strictly content-focused resources like the Khan Academy videos, they're not really helpful in identifying the high-yield content. And I'm not saying this in any way to rip on those resources in terms of their value. I think it's just important to recognize the niche that they occupy in terms of your preparation, because textbooks and videos like the Khan Academy videos are absolutely great as content review materials, helping you just shore up content knowledge gaps and make sure that you're on the same page with the level of content that's important. But you'll notice that a lot of those won't really intersperse, application. That is, okay, here's the content that you need to know. Now, how is this going to show up on test day? Here's a practice question of what that's actually going to look like. And that's the thing that's really important that you're thinking about, because even if you're, for example, sometimes people want to use their undergrad notes from their various courses. Those kinds of things are even further removed from the actual experience of test day, especially since a lot of the content that you learn in undergrad courses is way beyond the scope of what's going to show up on the exam. And so this focus is really, really key. Now, to make this as concrete as possible, let's talk about the MCAT organic chemistry questions. So 80 to 85% of all of the MCAT organic chemistry questions are going to rely on one of three core fundamental principles. The first one is the general physical properties and intermolecular forces of common functional groups. So understanding how different functional groups on molecules affect their physical properties, how they affect their interactions with other molecules, with the solvents that they're in, things like that. So that's number one. Number two, the relationship between pH and pKa, how that affects solubility, charge, reactivity of organics. So this is pretty closely tied in with the first one, and that is just understanding what happens to a molecule in solution, particularly aqueous solution. By and large, that's the focus of the MCAT, because that's the focus of any biochemistry and biologically relevant chemistry is largely what's soluble in the blood and in water. So this is really, really important to get a sense of what happens as you affect the environment of a molecule, again, particularly the aqueous environment of a molecule. And the last one is the basic foundational principles of reactions. And so that includes understanding nucleophiles and electrophiles, understanding how steric hindrance affects reactivity. And so all of these things, these three core principles are intertwined. But what you'll notice is that there's a lot of stuff that you learned in undergrad organic chem that is missing from this, right? Electron pushing diagrams, memorizing all sorts of reaction conditions for different types of reactions, memorizing all sorts of different types of reagents that will initiate or quench certain reactions, right? There's a lot of aromatic organic chemistry that just doesn't show up on the exam, period. And so what I tell students is, look, if you take the syllabus, the AAMC syllabus on face, and you assume that everything is going to be roughly equally likely to show up on the exam, then what you're inevitably going to do is spend a disproportionately large amount of time studying something that is going to be disproportionately less focused on the exam. Whereas if you focus your time and if you basically know nothing else other than these three core things, and you know them like the back of your hand, then you're going to be in a much better position to do really, really well on these questions, even if you don't know a lot of the core content. And again, I think this is one of the big things that impacts people's performance on test day. Either is having, for whatever reason, focused on or thought about these things in the past, or just understanding that not everything is created equal in terms of the actual core materials on the exam, and that inappropriate focus hurts you because you end up spending less than the amount of time that you otherwise could really focusing on the high yield content. So with that, let's switch gears, or not switch gears. Let's do something slightly different, and let's try out this practice problem. So this is a problem that is from our course. It is a problem that was one of our questions of the day. So we've got close to about 3,000 free practice questions of the day. So this is a question that I wrote a number of years ago, and I'd like you to go ahead and try. Just think about what you think the correct answer is, and I'll give you, let's say 45 seconds. Try this one out, and then Linda's just going to ask you to raise your hand. I'll go through the different answers, and we'll take the temperature of the seminar and see what you guys think the correct answer is here. So
Okay.
Go ahead and try this out.
So you have about 30 seconds left, right? I'm looking at my watch, and mind you, my science background is such that I don't know what that means, but it's okay. I can handle the voting. All right. How many of you would vote for A? Please click on the hand icon. Okay. And how many of you would vote, wait, don't put your hands up yet. How many of you would vote for B? Okay. And how many of you would vote for C? Okay. And finally, how many for D? Okay. So A got 28%, B got 13%, C got 14%, and D got 21%.
Okay, great. So that's roughly what I expect. Generally, A is a little bit more overrepresented. I usually see it somewhere in the range of a third, upwards of half of people select A. So you guys did pretty well. About a fifth of you got this one right. The correct answer here is D. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit more about how to think about this problem. Now I just want to make sure, can you guys see, can you guys see this circle that I've drawn?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just want to make sure that that's working as expected. So one of the key things to be thinking about when you see a reaction like this, now you've probably never seen this molecule before. I'd be kind of surprised if you had, because I made it up. One of the things you should be thinking about whenever you see a reaction is what's changing, right? What's different between the reactants and the products? And so you'll notice that this is a pretty complex molecule, but there really isn't a lot going on here with this reaction. What I essentially have is a 2-carbon chain right here, and I have a 4-carbon chain right here. That is literally the only difference. And so if you sort of think through your MCAT organic chemistry reactions, there's essentially just 2 different options. And we're not even thinking about this in very specific terms like what type of reagent it might be in terms of whether it's an alcohol in a basic solution or anything like that. But I'm thinking, focusing very broadly here on just what could I do to this molecule to change it. And one option is to simply add another 2 carbon atoms and just add an ethyl group onto the end of that methyl group. So there's one option. And the other option is to pull off this 2 carbon chain and to replace it with a 4 carbon chain. Now, if you know, even at a very, very cursory level, basics about MCAT organic chemistry reactions, you would know that adding an alkyl group directly onto an alkyl group is not going to happen. Not in any MCAT relevant reaction, right? So the reason is because they're just not reactive. Alkyl groups are, they're not reactive. There's no leaving groups there. There isn't any high differential in electronegativities, and so they're pretty comfortable, pretty stable as they are. Now, A was the most popular answer here, and like I said, that is essentially exactly as expected. And part of the reason is because we're taught in undergrad organic chemistry courses to believe, and which is actually true, that Grignard reagents are incredibly robust, right? That they can do all sorts of reactions and that their primary value is in alkylating things. But thinking more about the structure and the type of reaction that a Grignard reagent will undergo, what it does is it turns the alkyl group into a nucleophile, and that nucleophile is going to go after electrophilic groups. In particular, in this case, it's going to go after the electrophilic carbonyls. So it's going to go after this electrophilic carbonyl and a bunch of the others, right? There's several carbonyl groups here. Now, thinking about that, so what should my end product look like in that case? Well, it should look something like this, right? It basically just turns this into an alcohol and adds the ethyl group right there. And in fact, some of these others would probably also react. So the molecule would look very, very different if this were a Grignard reaction. Let's talk about let's not talk about some of the others right now. So everything that I've said so far sounds pretty organic chemistry heavy. And so if you're sitting there thinking, well, you just said that 80 to 85% of the questions are going to be based on these 3 core fundamental topics, and here you are giving us an example of a question where you actually need to know a decent amount of the details of organic chemistry. What I submit to you about this question is that you don't actually need to have known any of that. You don't need to know that this is actually called a transesterification reaction, that it's either acid or base catalyzed. Let's assume that it's base catalyzed. It'll turn this butanol into a butoxide anion or an alkoxide anion, which is highly nucleophilic, will go after the electrophilic carbonyl and knock off this ethoxide ion as a leaving group, which will regenerate as ethanol. You can know that that's the same reaction that is responsible for the production of biodiesel. And actually, this is on the double AMC syllabus, so you technically do need to know this. But again, I submit to you that you don't need to know that. You can answer this question simply by counting the number of carbon atoms. All you need to know is to be able to count, really. You need to see there is a 2 carbon chain here. There are 2 carbon atoms in a row. And that in my product, there are now 4 carbon atoms in a row. And so therefore, my reagent, given the fact that I can quickly eliminate simply adding an alkyl group directly to the end there, my reagent is going to have 4 carbon atoms in a row, right? My reagent is going to have this group on it, somewhere. Now, I don't need to know whether it's a Grignard reagent or whether it's a carboxylic acid or an ether, right, or an anhydride, right, whether it's going to be I don't really care. I'm just going to be looking for something with approximately this structure because that's going to narrow down a lot. And you'll notice that only one of the answer options actually has that, that structure, is remotely close. It's not A, it's not B, even though it has 4 carbon atoms in it. This is diethyl ether, and it's actually just 2 ethyl groups broken up. So again, it's not a 4-carbon chain. C, again, even if I could do it with a carboxylic acid, potentially, not in this case, but maybe with some intermediate steps and more modifications, there's only 3 carbon atoms there. It's not a 4-carbon chain, and so the only remotely plausible answer here is D. And so now, as you're thinking about what we just did there, you might be thinking, well, is the MCAT really going to do that? I mean, if it's that easy to approach it, you know, that doesn't sound super realistic about what the exam's going to be like. And yet, let's think about and remember what percentage of you got this question right. Right? If this were an easy question, most of you should have gotten this right. There's nothing tricky that we did here. There's nothing fancy. This was not in any way, shape, or form a trick question. This is absolutely the kind of question and the kind of thinking that you'll need to do on test day. And frankly, this is on the more challenging side of the kinds of things that you'll need to do. But if you think that this is not realistic in any way, shape, or form, you just haven't done enough practice questions, the MCAT absolutely will structure not only the questions like this, but it'll also structure the answer options. And what I mean by that is they're not going to give you something like, here's a 4-carbon chain, and then all they do is just vary, okay, it's an OH or a Cl or a COOH, right? They're not just going to do that because then it doesn't really become a game about, you know, interpreting the molecule and predicting what the reaction would be. Then it really just becomes straight up about, do you know the name of this type of reaction and how it's going to be done. So that's not really the thing that they're going to vary. They will be more broad, and the answer options will often be more diverse. Now you'll see questions like, you know, name some attribute or identify some attribute about this disaccharide, and then all of the answer options will look very, very similar. They'll all be disaccharides, right? So still, there's some key differentiating factor that you're identifying about those different answer options. As far as the MCAT writers are concerned, those answer options are all quite different from each other, but one of them is going to, you know, stand apart from the others by some fairly obvious metric when you sort of step away from the core content that it's really about. And so, having said all of this, I don't want to leave you with the impression that there's a shortcut to every single question. That's not always the case. But what you will find oftentimes is that with a lot of these more challenging questions, you'll see that you could do sort of the brute force content regurgitation method where, you know, I know this is a transesterification reaction because I drilled it into my head for 8 hours a day for 6 months. Or you can take the more creative shortcut route, which is, let me think about what kind of expectation I'd have for a reagent that looks kind of similar to this. And, you know, one of them is going to take you a lot longer. But on the flip side, the second method, right, is a little bit more counterintuitive in the sense that it's not immediately obvious how you should approach it, right, how you should think about it. And that's where I think it's really key to be doing a ton of practice. But in some cases, if you don't have necessarily the best track record with standardized tests, or you're not really sure about how to approach all of this, is to sort of help get that structure from, whether it's a tutor, whether it's an in-person course, somebody else, you know, whether it's a study group where, you know, you're with a bunch of other really smart people who have a sense of how to play this game. But do this with others who can sort of show you how to think about some of these things. Because when you think about it once, when you learn about it once, that makes it much easier to sort of get through it and do it yourself next time. But practice is really key. So that's all I've got for you on that front. So that's mistake number 2. Let's do mistake number 3. So mistake number 3 is a weak performance evaluation. Now, what will often happen is a student will take a practice exam or a number of different passages, and then they'll just look at the correct answers, think about very casually, I should have gotten that one right. Okay, cool. Next. And then they'll be done. And then they'll move on to the next set of practice questions. There's this perception that the more practice questions you do, the better off you're going to be. And that's really only true if you're doing it right, right? You can do 100 really bad push-ups and not get as good of exercise as you would if you did 20 really good push-ups, right? So doing it right is key. And so it's really important to be taking the practice exams that you're doing, taking the passages that you're doing, and really going deep into the analysis of what happened, doing postmortems on why you got a certain question wrong, what you need to know or do next time to not make that mistake again, and what you should be reviewing in the near future to shore up that gap. And on the flip side, to be analyzing why did I get this question right, and to make sure that you're getting questions right for the right reasons. Right? As much as you can guess and get questions wrong, you may also guess and get questions right. And you don't want to take it on chance that you're going to get that question or that type of question right next time. So people, by and large, totally ignore the questions they get right, but you didn't always get it right for the right reasons, and if you don't analyze why you should have gotten it right, then you may very well get it wrong next time. So what we recommend here is the first thing obviously is take the practice exam, take the section, and immediately write out some of your impressions. So are there certain areas where you're consistently running short on time or feel really fatigued, right? And track this over time so that you can see if you're improving. And then wait. And I really recommend this because if it's really, really fresh in your mind, it dramatically increases the chances that you're going to excuse away why you've gotten certain questions wrong. You really want to kind of look at things with a fresh eye after 1 or 2 days, where you can be a little bit more objective about what happened and what might be missing. Now, next, create a spreadsheet, and in that spreadsheet, log every single question and log why you got it right, why you got it wrong, and then, since it's in a spreadsheet, you can do a little bit more statistical analysis on, are there particular types of questions? Are there particular reasons that are coming up about why you're getting things wrong over and over again? And this is really, really key, because you might find that, and this is often the case, that students have a preconceived notion about why they get particular types of questions wrong, and it ends up being not supported by the data. For example, oftentimes students initially have this visceral reaction, well, I'm getting most of my questions wrong because I narrowed down to 2 and then I just picked the wrong one. And sometimes that's the case, but oftentimes it's not. And in fact, oftentimes it's not as simple as that, that there's some other underlying cause there, which is, it's only happening on chem and physics questions, which means that it's more about your content knowledge gaps than it is about, strategy or timing or things like that. So this kind of deep dive analysis is really, really key. And then that sort of gives you a path forward about what you should be doing to fill those gaps. Because if you're not really doing that work, then you're kind of running around like a chicken with its head cut off, thinking, okay, I got to do physics and chemistry, and I just got to sort of inhale it all. Whereas if you're approaching it much more strategically, identifying what are my weaknesses, what are my strengths, it really gives you an opportunity to spend the right time. And like I said in mistake number 2, thinking it's all about the content, the flip side of that is thinking it's all about just generic practice, right? It's not. There's high yield content that you should be focusing on. And sometimes it's because it shows up pretty often on the exam, but other times it's because you're particularly weak at it. And that's an area that you need to prepare for. So mistake number 4 is not experimenting with the studying. And I think that this is really, really important because students often have, like some of the preconceived notions that I just talked about, students often have preconceived notions about what way or what approach in terms of studying works best for them. And my contention is that most of us haven't actually properly experimented with different study methods. What happens is we're in elementary school and middle school and we start having to take tests, and then we feel a certain way about a particular study method, like we feel very strongly about flashcards one way or another, and then that basically influences the way that we think about studying for the rest of our lives. And so what I want to challenge you to do is sort of throw all of that out the window and approach this from a more scientific perspective, which is to say, let's assume that the child version of myself might have made a mistake, or let's assume that I've changed, and maybe there are other ways of studying that are really that will really be very helpful for me, and have some variables, have some controls in your experiment, and track your results. Give yourself a good amount of data with particular study method. So maybe you have a bias against flashcards. Try them out again. Maybe you'll find that they really work for you. But really give them a fair shot and track your results with how it goes. Maybe you feel very strongly against, strongly against videos, for example. And it turns out that videos actually really work well for the current version of yourself. So this is really important because, again, it really helps you optimize your time so that you're not, you might be doing the right things, but if you're doing it in the wrong way, then you're doing it really inefficiently. For pre-meds, it's all about efficiency. You have so much other stuff to be thinking about. Spending the wrong time on test prep is just not a valuable use of your time. Okay, last mistake is stressing out about the score. So with all that I've said so far, it's all about optimizing your score. And it is about optimizing your score. You'd obviously rather have a higher score rather than lower score. I've actually taken all of these figures from a blog post that I did on accepted.com. So you all can go check that out and read that blog post more fully. But I figured I'd take this opportunity to actually talk a little bit more about it. And I think it really is important to understand the impact that different percentiles of MCAT scores have on the admissions process, right? At the end of the day, having an ultra-high MCAT score can be a little bit more about ego than it is about admissions. I think we can all sort of admit that there's a great deal of ego in how you're going to do it. You're competitive, you're high achievers. That's what being a pre-med is about. But at a certain point, it's just not going to do you significant favors in terms of admissions. And the real impact that this has in terms of your studying is I've had students insist on taking on a retake, after getting an 85th percentile score. And that may not be helpful. It really depends on your goals, right? Not everybody is absolutely committed into getting into a top 5 school. For some of you, that is, and that's great. You're going to want to get a top score. But for most people, it's, I want to be a doctor, right? And that goal has many paths. There's many paths to achieve that goal. and it can be really basically any decent medical school. So if we look at some of the, let's first talk about the top left table that I've got, which is the percentiles. I have the old MCAT scores there just for reference so that you get a sense of the comparisons if you think more in terms of the old MCAT scores, but also because admissions data, there aren't enough longitudinal or longer term admissions data for the new MCAT, and so a lot of what we have to go on is still the old MCAT scoring system. So I have a conversion there for you, even though they're technically not interconvertible completely. But roughly, a 30 on the old MCAT is essentially a 508 on the new MCAT, which is basically in 77th, 80th percentile. So you can see what those percentiles roughly look like, and in terms of the GPA MCAT combination, you can see that this the slope of this line here. Essentially, let's not talk about the slope right now, but that line is not a cutoff, but is the threshold at which you get more than 50% of students getting admitted to med school. Now, this is admissions somewhere. So this isn't admission to my top school. This is admission to med school, just full stop. And the reason why you get some of these other artifacts is because there just aren't very many people in this combination, right? There just aren't that many people who get a top MCAT score but have below a 2.7 GPA, right? There's maybe 3 people, and so a couple of them get in, and that skews those results. But you get really large volumes, really large numbers of people sort of in this area. And so this is sort of the 50% cutoff. So that does not mean that if you're on the blue range that you're screwed, right? It doesn't mean that at all. But this is really where you get significant advantages in terms of the admissions process. Now, the slope of this line I think is interesting because you will see that there is there's a bias towards GPA, and so it's more important, especially as you see, there's a lot of these larger circles, higher admissions rates here for people with higher GPAs and lower MCAT scores. And so what that first off illustrates is that GPA frankly is more important than the MCAT. Not to say the MCAT's not important, but that having a high GPA and a lower MCAT is often better than having a low GPA and a higher MCAT. Now, none of this actually gives you any significant incentive not to stress out about the MCAT score. I just want to sort of lay the groundwork for roughly what to expect in terms of what kind of percentiles it takes to really give yourself some solid chances. The thing that I want to, the information, the data that I want to give you that will hopefully diminish a little bit of that stress is what actually happens to a particular student with a particular GPA when they raise their MCAT scores. Okay. Now, obviously, these are global aggregate data. So this is data over the course of, I believe, 3 years. So we're talking about tens of thousands of students here, and everybody is different. So that's my disclaimers. Don't take this to mean exactly this is you, but by and large, this is largely applicable. So let's take a look at the graph on the left here. So I've got the MCAT score ranges on the right. This is all AAMC data, by the way. So this is all public information. You can go and download it. You have to dig a little bit on their website to find this information, and it's all in illegible tables. This is a tool that we've created called the MCAT, the retake calculator. And so all you do is type in your GPA, your MCAT score, and you can sort of play around with it, and it'll give you these graphs based on some of those unreadable tables. So let's take a student with, this is a student with a relatively low GPA. I forget exactly what number I put. I think it was like a 3.0 or 3.3, something along those lines. You can see it on the blog. But that student, in a score range of 24 to 26, and so you can correlate that to roughly what that would mean on this table here. That student doesn't have great chances of getting in. Less than a quarter of students with that GPA MCAT score range are going to get in somewhere. And there is significant benefit to raising your score, right? If you can bring, let's say, a 25 to a 30, it essentially doubles your chances of getting admitted. Now, this isn't a completely unreasonable increase in your score. Maybe this is a little bit more ambitious to go from a 25 to a 40, but that'll help you a lot as well. But what you will notice is, if this student had been, let's say, here, in terms of their MCAT score, then raising it, stressing out about getting a 33, it's not going to do you many favors, to get a 37, right? In terms of your overall admissions chances. Now, the red line that's plotted here is your chances of achieving that score on a retake. So you can see that they are actually not too bad initially. So a lot of people can make this jump, but it becomes progressively more difficult. So you have that to factor in as well. Now, because this is global data, it takes into account all sorts of stories and reasons about why students didn't manage to achieve certain scores on a retake. Maybe they didn't study as well. Maybe they only took the second exam a month after the first, and they didn't give themselves time to really reflect and prepare properly the second time around. But you should still think about these statistics in terms of what impact they have on whether retake is worthwhile. Now, let's take a student with a higher GPA. And yeah, this is the last slide, guys. So I know we're running very short on time, but we're essentially done here. We take a student with a higher GPA. You got obviously a higher chance of getting in, right? And what you'll notice is for this student with that relatively high GPA, getting a much higher score doesn't do you significant favors in terms of your chances of getting in. And so a retake should really be considered with your GPA, but also in terms of what you see on your score report when you finally get your scores back, right? Some people are really disappointed with these scores, and again, that might be more about ego than about your actual chances of getting in. Again, this is about getting in somewhere. So don't stress out about it too much. Honestly, your GPA is more important, and hopefully I've given you some tips to prevent getting a lower score. But the reality is that a lot of these, for example, averages that you'll see, they truly are averages in terms of admissions. The law of averages dictates that people got lower than that score. And so, don't think that you always have to beat the average in order to get into a particular school. All right, so let's wrap up here. I just wanted to give you guys some of these resources, some things to think about in terms of where you can go for thoughts about the MCAT, for free resources, some of them paid. We have a bunch of free resources on our website. We have some things that are paid as well. Our course is obviously paid. The Khan Academy videos are free. The AAMC practice exams and question packs are paid. There's tons of MCAT courses. What I do want to point out is that there are a lot of pre-MCAT 2015 resources out there that are still available online. I strongly recommend that you use materials from reputable sources that have updated their materials, because there's a lot of changes from the old exam to the new one, and so there's a lot of stuff that's not applicable, and it's really hard to wade through what's relevant and what's not. So make sure that if you're getting it from any random website, that you're getting it from a website that is constantly updating its materials and that has explicitly updated them for the new exam. So I'm going to leave this up. Actually, I'm going to leave up the Q&A now that we're done. But I'm just going to put this here for you guys. This is some of the stuff that we have available on our website and links for it. And so there's plenty of stuff that you guys can do at sort of all kinds of budgets, especially the free question of the day. And the vast majority of our students don't actually manage to complete anywhere near all of that content. So thank you again. I'm all done now, so we can do the Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Alec. Yes, we are going to have at least a couple of questions because we have run out of time. Before we get to the Q&A, I want to again thank Alec for this great webinar, and I want to thank you all for attending. I just posted the link to Alec's blog post, his very thoughtful blog post on when and who should retake the MCAT with some of the charts that he also posted. A few reminders before we get to the Q&A. MCAS opens May 3rd when you can start inputting data, and you can start actually submitting your applications on June 7th. If you would like help with the non-MCAT portions of your medical school applications, then please check out accepted.com/medical for absolutely tons of free resources, articles, webinars, podcasts, videos, you name it, we've got it. For individual assistance with top medical school admissions consultants, please visit accepted.com/medical/services. And again, we'll be providing you these URLs in follow-up emails. As you leave, please take a moment to complete our short survey. And again, we're still going to have the Q&A. We do value your feedback. You'll be able to review this webinar early next week online. We're going to post it for you. And we'll also send you an email letting you know when it's available. Now, we do have some questions, and we're going to take some more too. The first one is from Sarah, and this is for you, Alec, and she asks, what is the latest time to take the MCAT to apply for this upcoming cycle? Would taking the test at the end of May and getting the score back at the end of June be too late? And you kind of addressed this at the beginning, but this is a little bit more direct.
Yeah, that's not going to be too late. Honestly, if you're taking the exam in May, even if you're taking it early June, I wouldn't feel like there's going to be any significant impact on the admissions for you. Where I start getting worried is when it starts getting into July. Yeah. So obviously the earlier the better, but it really starts to be a concern once you get to the end of June, early July. But there's no bright line. You can take it in August, at the beginning of August, and you can still get into med school. So again, just thinking about it in terms of diminishing, as a disadvantage and an increasing disadvantage over time.
Right, and I think this was actually the first MCAT. I don't think this is a retake. But I happened to listen to a podcast this morning on medical school headquarters about a fellow who submitted his MCAS application, I think in June or early July, but only had the test score back in September. So his application wasn't complete until September, and he actually got in. He had several interview invitations, and he got in. So it's kind of a question. I certainly agree with Alec that it's not too late in June, but at the same time, I think if you're going to take it later, then it kind of becomes a personal preference choice. Does the possibility of getting in earlier, is it worth it to you to have a reduced chance of acceptance, but still a higher than if you do nothing? So it's not a yes or no question. It's just you weighing up the costs and benefits of different choices. Some people, the idea of rejection, I think, would be devastating. They should only apply when it's optimal, the first week of June, the first week that MCAS is open, the test behind them, etc. If you can handle a rejection, then it makes more sense to have the chance of starting medical school earlier. But it's a personal question. All right, let me stop talking and let Alec talk. Apeksha asks, I struggle with staying in one area while preparing for the MCAT. What do you recommend to improve on this? Thank you. Thank you for the great question.
So I'm gonna assume you're not talking about physical area, and that you're thinking that you're asking about focus in terms of content.
Yes, that's my guess.
The way that the way because of, for some people it isn't, right? And I guess one important little tip is study in a quiet area and study in as close to exam conditions as possible. Because some people, their study thing is, I'm going to sit there, I'm going to do practice questions in a coffee shop, it's going to be kind of loud, I'm going to have my earphones on and my headphones in, listening to music, and I'm going to have my coffee, and that's my that's sort of my game plan. Test day is going to be a very jarring experience for you because it's going to be dead quiet. There will be nobody around. You won't have the smell of coffee. You won't have your coffee sitting next to you, and it's a viscerally very different experience. So in terms of the physical location and the conditions under which you practice do have an impact in terms of your preparedness for the overall experience of test day. But as far as the content itself, if you're having trouble focusing, it sounds like my diagnosis with limited information would be that you don't really have a lot of, you haven't sort of laid out a strategy, a core strategy for how to sort of plan out your time. And to really focus on, looking, when is my test date? What day is it today? How much time do I have roughly each week to prepare? And sort of segmenting out what kind of milestones you need to accomplish. Now, some people take this too far, and they'll, create a calendar, and every single day they'll they'll make a bulleted list of, I'm going to do this at 2 o'clock, and then I'm going to do this at 2:30, right? That I think is a lot more granular, because what's going to happen is 2 weeks from today, you're going to feel sick, or you want to go out with a friend, and your whole schedule gets thrown off. I always only build milestone-based schedules with students to say, okay, within these 2 weeks, these are the major things you should be accomplishing. And the other thing that I'll say about it is, at least the way that we structure the course, all the content is linear. And the reason why it's linear, by that I mean we do physics, we do all of physics, we finish it, and then we do general chemistry, and then organic chemistry, and then biochemistry. And the reason why we do all of that is so that everything is not just so it's all in a cohesive unit, but so that you're thinking about the important segues and the cross-application of content, right? Content should build on itself. There's a lot of general chemistry that relies on physics principles, and there's a lot of organic chemistry that relies on general chemistry principles. And so you should constantly sort of be building on that content. If you jump around too much, then you sort of silo things as, okay, this is physics, and then this is general chemistry. And the problem with silos is that they don't show up that way on the exam. They're much more interdisciplinary, and the passages will have maybe a general chemistry question or two, maybe a physics question, they'll throw in a biochem question in there. And so these different perspectives, and again, building on that content is really key. But I'd say if you're having a hard time really getting that focus, it's because you don't really have a strong schedule in place to sort of guide how you're approaching the content.
Great, thank you. Here's, I think what's going to be the last question, though I will give you ways to get a hold of Alec afterwards. Apeksha thanks you for this. Maybe I'll take two questions. Sarah asks, what is the goal or trend for total number of quality hours spent on MCAT studying to score 80% and higher? I know, can you answer that in general, or is that something that's very much individual? Should I repeat
sorry,
it?
Can you actually repeat that question?
Okay. What is the goal or trend for total number of quality hours spent on MCAT studying to score in the 80th percentile and higher? It's an interesting question, but I suspect it's individual, isn't it?
Yeah, it is very, very individual. So I'll tell you, on the accepted.com blog, it's public information that I went to HBS. So I went to Harvard Business School, and a lot of my classmates, a decent number, are MD MBAs. So I got very close with a number of Harvard Medical School students, and I can tell you that a lot of them and a lot of their partners whom they met at HMS would take the MCAT with essentially zero studying and would get 43, 44, 45.
Wow.
These things just happen, right? There's some people who they know the content like the back of their hand. They've always done well on standardized tests. It's just geared to the way that they think about the world. And that's good for them, right? The vast majority of us can't bank on things like that, myself included. For the rest of us, it takes time. On the other hand, I've had a student who got a 13 the first time that she took the exam, and then took a year to study and got a 32, after working with us, but it took a full year for her to really feel confident and ready. It just varies so much, but I would direct, I think the majority of students are covered by this sort of framework that I've laid out here in terms of roughly thinking about the timing, and you can sort of multiply this out in terms of the number of weeks that it's told you and roughly the amount of time per week that you should be spending. But yeah, it varies so much. Some people have no problem getting an 80th percentile, and for others it really takes a lot of work.
Right. I know this was the exams were very different when I was applying to college, but I know my sister, her mind works like a standardized exam. Our grades were actually very similar. And I think the lowest standardized test grade she ever got was a 780. And they were all at the time, they were all on the 800 scale. Mine were good, but nothing like that. Okay? And our grades were almost identical. So anyways, it is very individual. Last question is from Matthew. How do you guys compare, wait a minute, let me get this. You compare your ePrep courses to Kaplan's ePrep courses, and what do you guys offer?
Sure. So I don't think that's actually a good slide to. Well, here. Let's go to this slide. And I'll sort of preface this and try to be as unbiased as possible. A course isn't for everyone. You should really identify whether a course is right for you. One of the major advantages of our course is actually a sort of logistical problem, which is a lot of other courses will lock you in once you pay them, and you pay them before you start the course. And so you're essentially taking a gamble on, that you're going to like the format, the structure, and the way that they teach the course, and that you're going to like the instructor as well. At that point, you're not getting a refund, essentially is what I'm saying. We structure all registrations for our course where you have a week. It is full, it's unabridged, you get access to everything. And if it corresponds with what your expectations were, if it's something that you want to stay with, you stay with it, and that's great. You should pick resources that are going to work for you. And if it's not really what you were looking for, then you get a full refund. We don't want students sort of stuck in our course who aren't going to get value from it. That doesn't help us, and it doesn't help you. But in terms of the content, in terms of the structure, I think this slide kind of gets at it. Other courses, and it is often instructor dependent, other courses are much more content review focused. And that is, many students report that their experience was the course was a walking, talking textbook. It was a person standing there basically reading through the textbooks with us. And if I just had the textbooks on my own, I would have gotten the exact same experience. I can't really fault some of these companies for doing that. Part of it is simply limitations in terms of the structure that they have. Right, if you're in Kansas, really in any city, college town, a lot of these in-person courses have a limited application pool from which they can source instructors, and so they're having to source instructors who maybe don't have any MCAT experience and just took the MCAT and did reasonably well. Maybe they don't have any teaching experience, right? So some of these places can hire fantastic instructors. Some of the instructors have no experience. And I think it's really important for you, as you're sort of thinking about what kind of thing might be a good fit for me, is first and foremost to ask, who is the instructor? And what's their track record of helping other people be successful? So in our course, the big thing is everything is on demand. It's pre-recorded. All the materials are basically available to you anywhere, anytime, but you still get direct access to us. So we don't have specific, at 3 p.m. Pacific, you come to lecture. And the advantage for you is you email me on a Sunday, I'll get back to you by Monday. Generally Monday, sometimes Tuesday, right? We have a 48-hour turnaround time, and then it allows us to actually get a more personalized experience with you. You're not sitting there in class wasting time, where you feel really confident, but you're also not rushed through content that you don't feel as comfortable with. So I think that's one of the big advantages of an online course that is self-paced, which a lot of other companies have. But I would really say that the fact that you get direct access to us, I'm a co-founder of the company, I work with essentially all of our students, is a big plus. And the course is a strategy-based course. I've told you that I really love a lot of the resources, the textbooks, the online free videos that you'll get from Khan Academy. Anybody's textbooks, reputable companies' textbooks, Kaplan's textbooks are really great. They're reference materials. We didn't reinvent the wheel with our course because you can get a lot of that stuff for free. There's no point in paying for a course if that's all you need. It's just content review. The goal of the course is to sort of bring all of those things together. We'll do a comprehensive review, but the goal of the course really is in coaching you and how to play the game. And I think that really is unique to the structure and to our intentions in terms of how we built the course.
Great. Thank you so much, Alec. There are still questions here. Can I direct people if they want to post questions on the podcast, and then you'll respond if they're the kind of technical questions that I can't answer?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. All right. So if you would like to, there are a lot of questions that we just don't have time to get to here. Alec gave a wonderful podcast. You've been a fantastic audience. If you'd like to get answer to your remaining questions, please go to accept.com/145, which is the podcast interview that I did with Alec. There's a blog post there. There are comments there, and you can just post your question in a comment. I'll let him know, and he'll come over and answer them for you. At this point, I want to remind you again, if you have non-MCAT questions related to the application process to medical school, please visit accept.com/medical. For individual assistance with your applications, please visit accept.com/medical/services. And then just take a moment to complete our short survey. We'll be posting the video of the webinar today's webinar, probably early next week, and we'll also send out an email to you letting you know about that when that video is available. Thank you so much. Have a very good evening, and good luck with the MCAT and with your medical school applications. Take care. Thank you, Alec.
Thanks. Take care, guys.